Hello, everyone, and welcome. Today we're going to be talking about Chapter 7, which is all about stratification. So what exactly is stratification? Well, stratification is systematic inequalities between groups of people that arise as intended or unintended consequences of social processes and relationships. So in essence, this is a hierarchical organization within a society that often falls into different groups of hierarchical power, prestige, status, and access to economic resources. In the 18th century, Jean-Jacques Rousseau argued that private property prevents social equality and that this inequality ultimately leads to social conflict. The Scottish Enlightenment thinkers Adam Ferguson and John Millar agree with Rousseau that private property creates inequality, but they also argue that this is good because it means that some people prosper and create assets. Assets are a form of wealth that can be stored for the future. The ability to create assets provides an incentive to work hard and be productive, which in turn leads to higher degrees of social organization and efficiency, and ultimately to an improved society and civilization. The irony, however, is that this ability to create and store surpluses is what causes inequality. Thomas Malthus also viewed inequality favorably, but only as a means for controlling population growth. He thought that a more equal distribution of resources would increase the world's population to unsustainable levels and ultimately bring about mass starvation and conflict. George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel's master-slave dialectic essentially says that most social relationships in the world were based on a master-slave model in which the master becomes as dependent on the slave as the slave is on the master. Hegel also believed that over time, society would have more and more free people and the master-slave model would die out as the primary social relationship. When looking at standards of equality, something for us to think about is that ontological equality is the notion that everyone is created equal in the eyes of God. A society of commerce in which the maximization of profit is the primary business incentive, like modern capitalist societies, is called a bourgeoisie society. We also have the equality of opportunity. This is the idea that inequality of condition is acceptable so long as everyone has the same opportunities for advancement and is judged by the same standards. This standard of equality is most closely associated with modern capitalist society and a cornerstone of argument made by civil rights activists in the United States in the 1960s. We also have equality of condition. This is the idea that everyone should have an equal starting point from which to pursue their goals. Belief in this standard of equality has led to policies such as affirmative action that try to compensate social actors for differences in their conditions or starting points. We also have the equality of outcome. This is the notion that everyone in a society should end up with the same rewards regardless of their starting point, opportunities, or contributions. This standard of equality is most closely associated with communist ideology, and critics argue that without greater incentives to work hard and be productive, people will slack off and social progress will be held up in what is termed as the free rider problem. When we're looking at these multiple equalities, again, the equality of outcome, the equality of condition, and the equality of opportunity, essentially the equality of opportunity says that everyone has the same chance to be within a society. The equality of condition says that everyone has the same starting point. The equality of outcome says that everyone has the same ending point. Part of the equality of opportunity is that you will have the same equality of condition or starting point, and the equality of outcome or the end point, but the equality of opportunity focuses on the tools and resources that you will have in between. So as much as we want to have equality, it's hard to be able to have that when nobody has the same, not everybody, I should say, has the same equality of condition or starting point, the same equality of outcome or the end point, and they don't have the same tools and resources, which is equality of opportunity. So while this sounds great on paper, in actuality and in practice, it is more challenging than we would like it to be, simply because we still have this ideology against minority and majority. And when you have that, you have groups of people and you have groups of people who are marginalized, and they're marginalized based on things like age, race, ethnicity, sex, gender. And under gender, you have gender expression, you have gender roles. We also have sexual orientation, different abilities, national origins, religious and spiritual beliefs. So again, while we all want to have the same equality of outcome, we want to have, or the end point, we want to have the same equality of condition, or the starting point, we want to have the same equality of opportunity, or the tools and resources to be able to take the equality of condition and achieve the equality of outcome. It's difficult to be able to do that at this point in time. Now let's look at different forms of stratification. The estate system is a politically based system of stratification characterized by limited social mobility that is best exemplified in the social organization of feudal Europe and pre-Civil War American South. The caste system is a system of stratification that's based on hereditary notions of religious and theological purity and generally offers no prospects for social mobility. This is seen in India as part of the Varna system, which is the most common example of a caste system today. We also have the class system. This is an economically based system of stratification that's characterized by somewhat loose social mobility and categories based on roles in the production process rather than individual characteristics. Karl Marx felt that society was divided strictly into two classes, the proletariat, or the working class, and the bourgeoisie, or employing class. Eric Olin Wright developed the concept of contradictory class locations, which is the idea that people can occupy locations in the same class structure that fall between two quote-unquote pure classes defined by Marx. Max Weber's concept of class is based on grouping people according to the value of their property or labor in the commercial marketplace. We also have the status hierarchy system. This is a system of stratification based on social prestige. This prestige can be linked to different things: occupation, lifestyle, membership in certain organizations, just to name a few. But sociologists has most often studied occupational status. This here is Table 7.1 is the relative social prestige based on United States occupations. Something to think about is that today, especially due to social distancing, when you look at the prestige of doctors and lawyers and dentists, they have a much higher social prestige than someone who works as a waiter or a waitress or a cashier. But yet, cashiers are now seen today in this daily, as of the date of this recording, they are seen as essential employees almost at the same level, if not at the same level, as doctors and nurses. Finally, we have the elite mass dichotomy system. This is a system of stratification that has a governing elite, a few leaders who broadly hold power in society. Vilfredo Pareto thought that the masses were better off in such a system called mediocrity, where the most skilled and talented people would reach the governing elite. C. Wright Mills, again, the gentleman who coined the term sociological imagination, viewed this system as dangerous and detrimental, as it consolidates power in the hands of the few who will act according to their interest as opposed to the interest of the masses. How is America stratified today? Well, the first thing to think about is that when we think about socioeconomic status and the stratification, we have to look at how we refer to an individual's position in a stratified social order, which is socioeconomic status. Sociologists use this term socioeconomic status to refer to any measure that attempts to classify groups, individuals, families, or households in terms of indicators like occupation, income, wealth, education, liabilities, and assets. When we think about these things, again, it's important to look at income, which is the money received by a person for work or investments. Wealth is a family or person's net worth or the entire asset value. That's huge in helping us understand socioeconomic status. In the United States, we have several classes. The upper class is associated with income, wealth, power, and prestige, but definitions related to specific levels of income or net worth vary. There is little consensus about how to define the middle class, yet almost 90% of Americans define themselves as being in the middle class. A further complication is how to separate the middle class from the working class. This is in figure 7.1. This is just a distribution of net worth in the United States as of 2016, and you can see that the top 1% makes up 40% of the distribution of net worth in the United States, while the bottom 80% only take up about 10% of the net worth in the United States. Something to think about. Let's go back to the middle class for just a second. Middle class has historically been composed of white-collar workers and the working class of manual laborers. However, in the post-World War II economic boom, the working class essentially merged with the middle class. Higher wages gave manual laborers access to markers of middle-class achievement, such as home ownership, providing their children with a college education, and an ample retirement savings. The income gap between high-income and low-income individuals has increased dramatically over the last 30 years. There are several competing theories exist as to why this has happened, but no matter how we look at it, poverty has still taken place. Poverty has an official government definition, but there are fewer official categories, such as the working poor and the non-working poor, sometimes called the underclass. These unofficial categories don't represent stable, homogeneous groups because people at the end of this socioeconomic status spectrum tend to shift in and out of poverty over the course of their lives. So something to think about is that as of 2018, the poverty line for a family of 4 was $25,100 a year. That's pretty low, y'all. When we look at inequality from a global perspective, let's take a broad view of this for a second. In looking at this broad view of history, global inequality has increased dramatically in the past 500 years. However, by some measure, there's been a noticeable decrease in income inequality in the last 20 to 30 years. One key to these conclusions is whether you look at inequality within different countries or between countries. Many scholars have examined the question of why Europe developed first and why many former colonies have struggled to improve social and economic conditions for their populations. Theories range from geographic differences to the importance of social institutions to the types of relationships different colonial powers had with and within their colonies. When we look at social reproduction versus social mobility, let's first look at the social mobility aspect. Social mobility is the movement between different positions within a system of social stratification in any given society. And when we look at social mobility, it can be either horizontal or vertical and can take place on the individual or group level. So when we look at social mobility and we look at horizontal improvement, that's going from being a cashier to an assistant manager. Vertical is going from being a cashier at Aldi's to being a cashier at Kohl's. We also need to look at structural mobility. This is mobility that is inevitable from changes in the economy, such as the expansion of high-tech jobs over the last 20 years. Exchange mobility occurs when people essentially trade positions. The number of overall jobs stay the same, with some people moving up into better jobs and others moving down into worse ones. When we think about this mobility, a mobility table is a way to examine the process of how individual mobility occurs by comparing changes in occupational status between generations. We also have the status attainment model. This looks at changes in occupational status between generations, but it includes factors like education attainment, income, and the prestige of a person's first job. Something to think about is that research shows that parental education and net worth, not occupation or income, best predicts children's educational outcomes as well as other outcomes specifically related to their finances, whether they will have more debts or liabilities, or if they will have more assets and more wealth. When we think about this, something else to think about is that there's class-based affirmative action. This is a result of race-based affirmative policies that most disadvantaged minorities are not helped, and interracial stratification ultimately becomes enhanced. meaning that people who are not white continue to remain in this cycle of the working class and the poor. Class-based affirmative action could address these inequalities within minority and majority communities. However, implementing such a policy would face difficulties in measuring and verifying students' social class, simply because when we look at class-based affirmative action, there are some students who their parents may or their grandparents may have wealth and income, but they themselves may be separated from those families, but still have to rely on those families in order to go to school, to be able to pay for college, and they might not be able to do that. Other students may come from lower income areas and not have the same opportunities as others who come from higher socioeconomic status areas. So while class-based affirmative action can be helpful, especially for groups of minorities who don't have the same equality of opportunity and the equality of outcome, as well as the equality of condition, it's still difficult to be able to work through this and to be able to implement them, even though there has been an ability to get people from lower socioeconomic status areas and groups to be able to do things like go to college, which they hadn't had the same opportunities to do so 20 to 30 years ago. I hope this was helpful for you today in understanding Chapter 7. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, please feel free to reach out to me. Otherwise, I hope you have a great day, and I'll see you soon. Take care.